Behind every perfect smile, there's a secret. Behind every beautiful home, there's a story no one dares to tell. Emily Holloway thought she had it all. Wealth, love, a family on the way. But one stormy night or skin, everything changed. Her husband, a charming millionaire, turned into her worst nightmare. And when she lost everything, someone came back for revenge. A father, a man who once believed in justice until justice failed. This isn't just a story of tragedy. It's a story of power, betrayal, and the price of silence. Stay till the end, because the final twist will leave you breathless. If this story grips your heart, hit like, drop your thoughts in the comments, and share it with someone who loves true stories that make you feel everything. Don't forget to subscribe, because what happens next is even darker. The grand mansion gleamed under the soft glow of the chandelier, its marble floors polished to perfection, each corner of the space an emblem of wealth and status. Chase Holloway, the millionaire businessman, stood tall with his wife, Emily, by his side. They were the perfect picture of success, the kind of couple people envied. Emily, 6 months pregnant, beamed with pride beside her husband. Their smiles were flawless, but the air between them was heavy, charged with something unspoken. Emily couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had lingered in her chest for weeks. There was something off. The way Chase's gaze lingered on other women, the way he grew distant when she reached out to him. But tonight, everything appeared perfect. The gala was in full swing and the spotlight was on them. Emily adjusted her gown, feeling the weight of the baby growing inside her, a constant reminder of the life they had built together. Her eyes scanned the room, catching the glint of champagne glasses and the flicker of the cameras. The guests, all dressed in their finest, surrounded them. Emily could feel the tension in her shoulders ease slightly, reassured by the crowd's adoration. But as her gaze shifted across the room, it landed on her. Vanessa Reed, the woman she had seen only a few times before, but whose presence always seemed to make Chase's smile just a little too eager, his posture too relaxed. Vanessa stood across the room, her gaze locked with Chase's. It was a brief glance, barely noticeable, but in that moment, Emily felt a cold shiver run down her spine. Vanessa's smile was confident, knowing. Emily's breath hitched in her chest as her hand instinctively moved to her belly. Chase caught her gaze, and immediately his expression shifted back to the charming, polished mask he wore in front of others. But Emily noticed. She always noticed when something was wrong. She forced a smile, pretending not to care, but her mind raced. "You're imagining things," she whispered to herself, a quiet battle raging inside her. She tried to brush it off, to focus on the guests and the conversation around her, but the feeling wouldn't leave her. Something was wrong, and it had everything to do with Chase. The night continued, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on her. Not just the cameras, but the ones that followed her every step. And when she finally looked away, she caught another fleeting moment between Chase and Vanessa. This time, their shared glance was more than just a passing recognition. It was filled with an understanding that Emily didn't want to acknowledge. Something deep inside her began to stir, a feeling she had tried to ignore for so long. The evening stretched on, and soon it was time to leave. Chase, ever the gentleman in public, took Emily's hand and smiled. "You look beautiful tonight," he said softly, though his words didn't reach his eyes. Emily nodded, forcing a smile. "Thank you," she replied. But she felt a tightness in her chest. Her mind flashed back to that moment at the gala, to the way Chase's eyes had softened when he looked at Vanessa. As they arrived at their car, Emily's hand brushed against Chase's, but he quickly pulled away. She could feel the distance between them. As the car drove through the city, Emily glanced at him, but he was staring out the window, lost in thought. "Chase," she began hesitantly, "what's going on?" He turned to her, an almost startled expression on his face. "What do you mean?" "I saw the way you looked at her," Emily said softly, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and hurt. "Vanessa, is there something I should know?" Chase's jaw clenched. He looked away, the smile quickly fading from his face. He sighed deeply, clearly annoyed. "Emily, don't start with this. You're tired. You've had a long day. Don't make a scene." "I'm not making a scene, Chase. I'm asking you to tell me the truth," she pressed, feeling the frustration building inside her. "Who is she to you?" The silence between them was thick. Chase turned to her, his face hardening. I'm working. That's all. You've been so emotional lately, Emily. I'm trying to handle everything. And this is what I get. Emily recoiled at his tone. She had never seen him this cold, not like this. I'm not imagining things. I saw the way you looked at her, the way she looked at you. She paused, feeling tears threaten to spill. I'm pregnant, Chase. We're supposed to be building a family. You promised me, you promised us. Chase's face softened, but only for a moment. He turned to look out of the window again, avoiding her eyes. I never promised you anything, Emily. You need to calm down. I'm doing what I can for us. Emily's heart sank as she turned away from him, staring out of the window herself. She knew that something had changed. This wasn't the man she had married. He was a stranger, and his promises meant nothing anymore. The next day, Emily found herself alone at home, the house feeling colder than usual. Chase had left early for work, as always, but today, something felt different. She wandered through their home, her mind preoccupied with thoughts of Vanessa. She had to know the truth. In the study, she searched through Chase's things. It was wrong. She knew it was wrong, but she had to. She found it. A hotel receipt from a luxury suite. The date marked 2 days before their gala. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she picked it up. A lipstick-stained glass. It was clear. The evidence she needed. Her stomach twisted as the truth sank in. She sat down, staring at the receipt, her heart pounding. She felt sick, betrayed, angry. How could you, Chase? She whispered to herself. She stared at the hotel receipt, her mind racing. He'd been lying to her for months, possibly longer. The affair was real, Vanessa was real, and what hurt the most was that Chase never thought she would find out. As the day wore on, Emily's anger turned to grief. The betrayal cut deeper than she could have imagined. But her grief wasn't just for the affair. It was for the life they were supposed to have, the future that was now slipping through her fingers like sand. And worst of all, it was for the child she had lost. The day passed, and when Chase returned, Emily confronted him in the cold silence of their living room. I found everything, Chase, she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of fury and sadness. Chase's face twisted in frustration. Emily, stop. It's not what you think, he said dismissively. Then tell me what it is, she snapped back. Tell me the truth. His eyes darkened. You want the truth? Fine, he spat. I'm tired of you being weak. I'm tired of pretending. I'm living my life. I'm done being all stuck in this little bubble with you. It's over. Emily stared at him in disbelief. Over? She whispered, her voice barely audible. He nodded. Yes, over. Her world crumbled. The night hung heavy inside the mansion. The storm that had been rumbling in the distance now rolled in full force, lightning cutting through the sky. Emily sat alone in the dimly lit living room, her body still shaking from the confrontation. Her tears had dried hours ago, replaced by a cold, hollow stillness. Chase had stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The clock ticked past midnight. Emily pressed a trembling hand against her belly. The baby kicked faintly, a small, fragile sign of life that brought both comfort and pain. We'll be okay, she whispered to herself, trying to believe the words. We'll be okay. But she wasn't. She couldn't stop seeing his face, the coldness in his eyes when he told her it was over, the indifference, the arrogance. He wasn't even sorry. And then there was Vanessa. That name burned in her mind like a curse. The confident woman at the gala, the one who had smiled at Chase with that knowing look. Emily could see her perfectly, tall, poised, with glossy dark hair and that smug air of superiority. A voice in her head whispered the question she'd been avoiding. Was this the first time? Had he done this before? Her heart sank as she remembered all the late nights, all the excuses about business trips and urgent meetings. She'd believed him because she wanted to, because love had blinded her. The rain outside began to pound harder against the windows. The sound was almost deafening. Emily stood up, her bare feet cold against the marble floor, and walked slowly toward Chase's office. It was his sanctuary. He hated when she went in there, which meant she had to. She opened the door quietly. The air inside was stale, heavy with the smell of whiskey and expensive cologne. His desk was immaculate, of course it was, but a half-empty glass sat beside his laptop. She hesitated for a moment before sitting down at his computer. The password screen glowed. She took a deep breath and typed the only thing that made sense. Vanessa. The screen unlocked. Emily's pulse quickened. Her hands were trembling as she scrolled through his emails, searching for something, anything. Then she found it, a folder labeled Consulting Projects Private, inside dozens of emails between Chase and Vanessa. Vanessa, the investors are impressed. I'll bring the final papers tonight. Chase, good. Come to the suite, room 302, and bring that red dress I like. Emily's breath hitched. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. She kept reading. Vanessa, you said you'd tell her soon. Chase, after the baby's born, I need to secure the assets first. She couldn't read anymore. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought she might faint. He was planning to leave her after the baby was born. He was just waiting until he could take everything from her. He didn't just betray me, he betrayed everything we were, everything I thought we were. The storm outside seemed to roar in sympathy as she slammed the laptop shut. She stumbled backward, pressing both hands to her face. For a long time, she stood there in silence, trying to breathe, trying to think. But all she could feel was the ache in her chest, the weight of betrayal pressing down on her until she could barely stand. When she finally gathered the strength to move, she walked to the window and looked out into the darkness. The city lights shimmered below, indifferent to her pain. Somewhere out there, Chase was probably with Vanessa, drinking champagne and laughing about the woman he'd fooled. She whispered, her voice breaking, "You'll regret this, Chase. I swear you'll regret it." The next morning came gray and heavy. Emily didn't sleep. She sat in the kitchen, staring at her untouched cup of tea. The sunlight struggled to break through the storm clouds outside. The door opened behind her. Chase walked in, his tie loose, his expression unreadable. "You didn't sleep," he said flatly. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice calm but icy. He poured himself coffee, ignoring her question. "You shouldn't be so emotional, Emily. It's not good for the baby." Her hands clenched around her cup. "Don't you dare talk about the baby." He glanced at her then, a hint of annoyance in his eyes. "You're overreacting. I told you, Vanessa works for me." "Don't lie to me," Emily said sharply. "I saw the messages." That got his attention. He froze, his hand still gripping the coffee mug. His jaw tightened. "You went through my computer?" "I had to," she snapped, "because you wouldn't tell me the truth." Chase set the mug down hard, the sound echoing through the room. "You had no right." "I had every right. I'm your wife." "Not for long," he muttered under his breath. Her heart sank. "What did you say?" He turned to face her fully, his expression cold, calculated. "You think you're the only one who's unhappy? I'm done pretending. This marriage is over." For a moment, the world stopped. Emily couldn't breathe. She felt her pulse in her throat, in her ears, in the ache of her stomach. "Over?" she whispered. "You're saying that while I'm carrying your child?" Chase's eyes flickered, but only with irritation. "I didn't ask for this, Emily. You wanted it. You and your perfect little family dream. But dreams don't pay bills. Business does." The cruelty in his tone cut deeper than any wound. Emily stood, her chair scraping against the floor. "You're a monster." He laughed bitterly. "You married a monster, sweetheart. Don't act surprised." She slapped him. Hard. The sound cracked through the air like a whip. Chase's head snapped to the side, his jaw tightening. For a second, silence hung between them. Then he smiled, a slow, dangerous smile. Big mistake. Before she could move, he grabbed her wrist, twisting it painfully. She gasped, struggling to pull away. "Let me go, Chase." "You think you can humiliate me? In my own house?" His grip tightened, his face twisted with anger. She shoved at him, but he was too strong. He pushed her backward against the wall. "You're hurting me," she cried to Boom. "Maybe you'll finally learn when to shut up," he growled. He raised his hand again, and for a moment, Emily thought he might hit her again. But instead, he stopped, breathing hard, his eyes burning with fury. He turned away, running a hand through his hair. "You're not worth this," he muttered. "I've got a meeting." And just like that, he left. The front door slammed. The sound echoed through the empty house. Emily slid down the wall, her knees giving way beneath her. She clutched her stomach, shaking. Tears streamed down her face, but they weren't tears of weakness anymore. They were something else, something colder. Hours passed. The storm cleared, but the darkness inside Emily didn't. She sat on the floor of Chase's office again, staring at his laptop. The glow of the screen reflected in her tear-streaked face. She opened a blank email and began to type. To Vanessa Reed. Subject, you win. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She wanted to send it, to lash out, to hurt back, but she didn't. She deleted the message. Instead, she opened a new document and began to write everything. Every detail of his affair, every insult, every bruise, every lie. She didn't know why she was doing it. Maybe it was the only way to make sense of the chaos. Maybe it was her way of taking back control. As she typed, she whispered through clenched teeth, "You'll pay for what you've done, Chase, one way or another." The next morning, she woke up to find the house empty again. But this time there was something new. On the kitchen counter lay a single white rose, Chase's signature apology. For a moment, she stared at it. Then she crushed it in her hand, thorns digging into her palm. The blood ran down her wrist, but she didn't care. He thought I was fragile. He thought I'd break. But what he didn't understand was, when a woman loses everything, she becomes something else entirely. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds. The storm had passed. But for Emily Holloway, it had only just begun. The mansion was quiet that evening. Too quiet. The kind of silence that sits heavy on your skin, that makes you feel like the air itself is watching. Emily stood by the window, her reflection faint against the storm outside. She hadn't eaten all day. The clock on the wall ticked past 9. Chase still wasn't home. Her fingers rubbed the edge of her wedding ring. The gold band felt like a shackle now, cold, foreign. She thought about calling her father, but dismissed the idea as quickly as it came. She hadn't spoken to Richard Monroe in years. The last time they'd talked, it had ended in shouting. He'd warned her not to marry Chase. Men like him don't love, Emily. They own. Back then, she thought her father was just being controlling. Now, she wasn't so sure. A car door slammed outside. The sound jolted her back to reality. Chase was home. The front door opened. She could hear his footsteps, heavy, deliberate, crossing the marble floor. The faint scent of whiskey hit her before he even reached the living room. He walked in, his tie loosened, his shirt half unbuttoned. He looked at her with the kind of bored indifference that cut deeper than anger. "You're up," he said flatly. "We need to talk." Her voice was calm, but inside she was shaking. Chase sighed, tossing his jacket onto the couch. "Not this again." "I found your emails." That stopped him. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. "What?" "Don't play dumb." Emily stepped closer. "You and Vanessa. I know everything." He laughed, low and cruel. "Everything? You think reading a few messages gives you the right to accuse me?" "You were going to leave me after the baby was born." Her voice broke. "You were going to take everything." Chase moved closer until he was inches from her face. His breath reeked of alcohol. "You've been snooping. That's not very ladylike." Emily's hands clenched at her sides. "You're disgusting." He tilted his head. "You should be grateful, you know. You get to live in this house, wear my name, enjoy my money. That's more than most people get." "You think money makes you powerful?" she snapped. "You're nothing without your lies." Something dark flashed in his eyes. He stepped forward suddenly, his hand gripping her chin. "Watch your mouth." She slapped his hand away. "Don't touch me." His expression hardened. "I've had enough of your dramatics." He grabbed her arm and shoved her back. She stumbled, catching herself on the staircase railing. "Chase, stop!" But he didn't. The anger that had been simmering in him for months finally boiled over. He grabbed her again, his grip tight enough to bruise. "You think you can embarrass me, ruin me?" he shouted. "You're lucky I don't—" "Don't what?" she spat, her eyes filled with fury and tears. "Hit me again? That's what you do best, isn't it?" He froze and then shoved her. Hard. Her foot slipped on the marble step. The world spun. For one terrifying heartbeat, everything slowed. Her hair floating in the air, her arms reaching for balance that wasn't there. Then came the crash. The sound of her body hitting the stairs echoed through the house. And then, silence. Chase stood there, breathing hard, staring down at her motionless form. Blood was pooling beneath her, dark and spreading fast. Emily? His voice was shaky now. Emily! He rushed down the stairs, kneeling beside her. Her eyes fluttered open, just enough for her lips to move. Our baby! And then she went still. For a moment, Chase didn't move. He just stared at her. Then slowly his expression shifted from shock to calculation. He wiped the sweat from his brow, straightened his shirt, pulled out his phone. There was an accident, he said flatly when his driver answered. Handle it before the press finds out. He hung up and looked down at Emily one last time. He didn't check for a pulse. He didn't even blink. Then he turned and walked away. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky. When the ambulance arrived 20 minutes later, Chase was gone. The paramedics found Emily barely alive, her pulse faint, her breathing shallow. The older medic, a man with kind eyes, pressed his fingers to her wrist. We've got one chance. Move! They loaded her into the ambulance. The rain hammered the roof as sirens cut through the night. Paramedic, her blood pressure's crashing. Nurse, we're losing the baby. The medic looked at the monitor, then back at Emily. Come on, sweetheart. Don't give up on me now. At the hospital, the chaos continued. The doctors moved with precision, shouting instructions. Machines beeped, hands pressed, monitors screamed. Emily's consciousness drifted in and out. Voices echoed around her. She saw flashes, the doctor's face, bright lights, the faint sound of a heartbeat that wasn't hers. Then, silence. When she woke again, it was morning. The room was white, sterile, and too bright. Her head was pounding. Her throat burned. For a moment, she didn't remember. And then it hit her. Her hands flew to her stomach. It was flat, too flat. The door opened quietly. A doctor stepped in, his expression somber. Mrs. Holloway, he began softly. I'm so sorry. Emily's voice was barely a whisper. My baby? The doctor hesitated. You survived. But the trauma was severe. He paused. Your baby didn't make it. The words didn't register at first. Then they did. All at once, her body began to shake. She couldn't breathe. Her sobs echoed through the sterile room. Voice over Emily. They say a mother's heart never forgets the sound of her child's heartbeat. Mine still echoes in the silence. Later that day, 2 men in suits came to her room. Corporate types, not doctors. One of them smiled tightly. Mrs. Holloway, Mr. Chase sends his regards. He wanted to make sure you're taken care of. Emily turned her head slowly, her voice weak. He sent you? The man nodded. He also wanted to prevent any misunderstandings with the media. If you could sign these documents, it would help everyone move forward. He placed a folder on her tray table. Inside were legal statements claiming the fall was an accident, that Chase had tried to help her. Emily stared at the papers. Her hands trembled. He hit me, she whispered. The man's polite smile froze. Let's not make this emotional, Mrs. Holloway. You sign this, and you'll receive full medical coverage and a generous settlement. If you refuse... He let the silence finish the threat. Before Emily could speak, a nurse stepped in, an older woman named Clara. She looked between the men and Emily, her expression sharp. She's in no condition to talk business, Clara said firmly. You can leave. The men exchanged a glance, but obeyed. Once they were gone, Clara turned back to Emily, her tone softening. You rest now, dear. You've been through hell. Tears welled up in Emily's eyes. He killed my baby. Clara hesitated, then stepped closer, squeezing her hand. I know, sweetheart. I know. She slipped something into Emily's palm, an envelope. He needed to know, Clara whispered. Who? Your father. Emily froze. Her throat tightened. No, she whispered. He can't know. I haven't spoken to him in years. Clara's eyes were full of quiet resolve. He already does, dear. And he's coming. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. The pain in her body was unbearable, but the ache in her heart was worse. She kept hearing her baby's last faint heartbeat in her mind, over and over. Rain tapped softly against the window. Outside, the city lights flickered. Inside, Emily lay awake, staring at the ceiling. I thought my life had ended that night. But in truth, something else was born. Something fierce, something that wouldn't die so easily. Somewhere across the ocean, in a mansion buried in snow, a phone rang. A man's trembling hand picked it up. "Sir?" a voice said on the other end. "It's about your daughter." The man's eyes darkened. His voice was calm but dangerous. "Tell me everything." The snow was falling in thick, silent sheets over the Swiss Alps. The world outside the massive windows of the Monroe estate was white, still, and cold. Like the man who sat in the leather chair by the fire, staring into the flames with empty eyes. Richard Monroe hadn't spoken to his daughter in 5 years. Not since the argument. He could still hear her voice from that day. Angry, trembling, defiant. "I love him, Dad. You can't control me forever." "You think that man loves you, Emily?" he'd said, his tone sharp and weary. "He loves what you represent. Money, power, access. You're a trophy to him, not a partner." "You're wrong," she'd cried. "He's nothing like you." He'd let her go then, heartbroken but proud, watching as she turned her back and walked away. That was the last time he saw her. Until now. The phone on the desk rang, slicing through the quiet hum of the fire. Richard didn't move at first. His assistant, Evelyn Hart, entered the room, her voice tight. "Sir, it's urgent." Richard looked up slowly. "Who is it?" "It's about your daughter." The words hit him harder than he expected. His hand tightened on the armrest. He hadn't heard anyone say your daughter in years. "Put it through." He picked up the phone. A woman's voice spoke on the other end, steady but emotional. "Mr. Monroe, this is Nurse Clara. I'm calling from St. Augustine Hospital in New York. I don't know how else to say this. Your daughter's alive, but she's in critical condition. She lost the baby." The room went still. The fire crackled softly, the only sound in the world. Richard said nothing for a long moment. Finally, in a low, controlled voice, "What happened?" "Domestic assault. Her husband, Chase Holloway." Richard finished the name like a curse. "Yes, sir." There was a pause, then the sound of something breaking. The glass of whiskey he had been holding shattered in his grip, amber liquid spilling down his hand. "Prepare the jet," he said, voice cold. "We leave in 1 hour." As Evelyn made the arrangements, Richard stood alone in the firelight, staring out at the snowstorm. His reflection stared back. Gray hair, sharp eyes, a face carved from stone. But beneath the surface was something else. Guilt. He had built empires, crushed competitors, manipulated markets. He had always believed he could control everything. Until Emily. When she left, he let her go, telling himself that she would learn, that she'd come back on her own. But she never did. And now she was broken. Because he hadn't been there. Evelyn re-entered quietly. "The plane's ready, sir. We'll reach New York by morning." Richard nodded, his voice distant. "Good. Have my lawyers look into Holloway's assets. Every company, every account." "Of course." He turned from the window, his face expressionless. "He took my daughter from me once. I won't let him do it again." The private jet cut through the night sky like a silent blade. Richard didn't sleep. He sat at the table with files spread in front of him. News clippings, financial reports, photographs. Chase Holloway's smiling face stared up from the pages. Self-made millionaire. Tech mogul. Philanthropist. Richard's lip curled. Self-made, my ass. He remembered Chase the first time they met. Charming, confident, too slick for his own good. The kind of man who looked people in the eye when he lied. Richard had seen 1,000 like him before. Men who thought success made them untouchable. Men who thought consequences were for other people. But he'd underestimated him once. He wouldn't make that mistake again. When the plane landed, the sun was just rising over New York City. The skyline gleamed gold and cold against the winter haze. Richard stepped off the jet with Evelyn beside him. The wind bit at his face, but he didn't flinch. "Take me to her," he said. The corridors of St. Augustine Hospital smelled of disinfectant and despair. Nurses whispered as Richard passed. Everyone knew who he was. Money had always been his weapon, and now it cleared paths before him. When he reached Emily's room, he paused outside the door. Through the glass, he could see her, pale, fragile, her face bruised, an IV in her arm. For a moment, he couldn't move. Evelyn's voice was soft. She's going to make it. He nodded, but his throat felt tight. Slowly, he pushed the door open. The faint beeping of machines filled the silence. He sat beside her, careful not to wake her, his eyes tracing every bruise, every bandage. His daughter, his little girl. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. I'm here now, Em. His voice cracked, barely a whisper. You're safe. Hours later, Emily stirred. Her eyelids fluttered open, hazy with pain and medication. When she saw him, confusion flickered across her face. Dad? He leaned forward, taking her hand gently. It's me. Tears welled in her eyes. You shouldn't be here. The hell I shouldn't, he said softly. You think I'm going to sit in Switzerland while that bastard walks free? She tried to sit up, grimacing in pain. Don't, please. Don't make this worse. He almost killed you, Emily. Her lip trembled. I know. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy, full of things that could never be unsaid. Finally, Emily whispered, You were right about him. Richard's eyes softened. That's not what I want to hear. It's true, she said. I thought love would change him. I thought I could make him see me, but he only ever saw what I could give him. Her voice broke. He killed our baby, Dad. Richard's hand tightened over hers, his jaw clenched. Then he dies for it. Emily's eyes widened. No, I don't want that. He looked at her sharply. You think I care what you want right now? Please, she pleaded, tears spilling down her cheeks. I've lost enough. Don't make me lose you too. The words cut deep. For a moment, Richard said nothing. Then he sighed and brushed her tears away with his thumb. Rest now, he murmured. We'll talk later. But in his mind, the decision was already made. That night, Richard met with Evelyn in the hospital cafe. The space was nearly empty, the fluorescent lights flickering faintly. You know what I need, he said. Evelyn nodded, sliding a folder across the table. Inside were documents she had already prepared. Corporate filings, shell company structures, offshore holdings. Holloway Enterprises is deeply leveraged, she said. If we move fast, we can buy controlling interest before he realizes who's behind it. Richard smiled faintly, but his eyes were cold. Good. I want his empire to crumble before he even knows it's falling. And Chase himself? She asked carefully. He looked up. I'll decide that when the time comes. Later, Richard returned to Emily's room. She was asleep again, her breathing steady. He sat down beside her, exhaustion finally catching up to him. He looked at her, the daughter he had failed, the woman she had become. He thought of the little girl who used to fall asleep on his shoulder while he worked late, who'd bring him coffee in her tiny hands and call it business juice. And now she was here, broken, because of him, because he hadn't protected her. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small photo. Emily at age 6, smiling, gap-toothed, holding a stuffed bear. He placed it on the nightstand beside her. You can rebuild a company. You can buy back reputation. But you can never buy back what someone steals from your blood. He stood and looked out the window. The city below was restless, alive, unaware that a storm far colder than winter was coming. Sleep well, my girl, he whispered. Your father's home, and I'm going to burn his world to the ground. The days that followed were a blur of meetings, strategy, and quiet conversations. Richard Monroe's return to New York had ignited a fire in him that he hadn't felt in years. The icy resolve that had once driven his rise to the top now burned hotter than ever. Emily was broken, and Chase Holloway would pay for it in full. Richard hadn't forgotten how easily men like Chase thought they were untouchable, but he was wrong. The man who had built vast empires in the shadows, crushing anything that got in his way, was now preparing to tear down a far more personal empire, that of Chase Holloway, and it wasn't going to be clean. Richard sat in his private office, papers scattered in front of him. Evelyn sat across the desk, her fingers typing quickly into her laptop. The steady clack of the keyboard echoed in the otherwise quiet room. The press is already starting to ask questions about Emily's condition, Evelyn said without looking up. Chase's PR team is working overtime to cover up what happened. They've spun the narrative that Emily's injuries were self-inflicted, that she fell down the stairs. Richard's face darkened. The bastard. He thinks he can lie his way out of this. He slammed his fist on the table, causing the papers to rattle. We'll tear his life apart, piece by piece. Evelyn nodded, her eyes narrowing. I've already had my team digging into Holloway's financials. He's leveraged almost every asset he owns, and there's a weak link in his real estate holdings, a series of shell companies that are about to implode. If we move quickly, we can wipe him out without him even realizing it. Richard leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. I want everything, every secret, every mistake, every lie he's ever told. We'll hit him where it hurts the most, his wallet. His eyes glinted with cold determination. But we need to go further. I want to make him feel the weight of every decision he's ever made. I want him to understand the cost of crossing me. Evelyn met his gaze and nodded. I'll accelerate the process. We'll have him on the ropes within days. Richard stood, his eyes narrowing as he stared out of the window, looking down at the city below. You're right, he said softly. Chase Holloway will fall, and when he does, I'll be the one to bury him. Meanwhile, Emily's recovery was slow and painful. The physical bruises had faded, but the emotional wounds were still raw. Every morning she woke up in the sterile hospital room and stared at the ceiling, wondering how it had all gone wrong. They say time heals all wounds, but that's a lie. Some wounds don't heal. Some of them just fester, waiting for the right moment to consume you. Emily hadn't spoken to Chase since the night of the fall. He hadn't visited her once, but she could feel his presence, the lingering taint of betrayal that clung to every thought, every memory. She couldn't even bear to say his name in her head. She sat by the window, watching the snow fall outside, the city covered in white. The world seemed so quiet here, so distant. But inside her mind was anything but calm. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Chase's face, his indifference, his cruelty. She saw the blood on the marble, the lifeless child she would never hold. She reached for the phone at her bedside, her fingers trembling as she scrolled through her contacts. She hesitated before pressing father. Richard had been silent for years, and yet here he was, her last hope. The phone rang. Emily? Richard's voice came through the line, sounding distant, as if he had been expecting the call. Dad, Emily whispered, her voice breaking. I need you. Later that evening, Richard arrived at the hospital. He didn't speak much, but his presence was a comfort to Emily. He sat by her bed, his hand resting on hers, his eyes filled with concern. I'm sorry, Richard said quietly. I should have been there. I should have protected you. Emily shook her head. It's not your fault. I knew who he was. I just didn't want to see it. No one could have known how far he'd go, Richard replied. But we can make sure he never does it again. I don't want revenge, Emily said softly. I just want him to feel what I feel. Richard's jaw tightened. He will. And when I'm done with him, he'll wish he never laid a finger on you. Chase Holloway sat in his penthouse, a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring at the city below. The news had already started to turn against him. His wife's accident had gone viral, and no amount of PR spin could erase the truth. The whispers were getting louder. He'd thought he could control the narrative, that his wealth and charm would always protect him, but he hadn't counted on Emily's father. Richard Monroe's return had shaken him. The man had been a ghost for so long, and now he was back, with a vengeance. Chase felt the weight of it, the sense that his life was beginning to unravel. He couldn't afford to lose everything. Vanessa, he muttered to himself. Where are you? The door opened and Vanessa walked in, her heels clicking on the marble floor. She was dressed in a sharp suit, her hair perfectly styled. She looked every inch the part of the successful businesswoman. But there was something about her that still unnerved him. Chase, she said, her voice low, almost teasing. You look like you've seen a ghost. He turned to her, his face hard. I'm in trouble. Your mess is starting to catch up with me. Vanessa smirked. You should have known better than to cross Richard Monroe. But don't worry, darling. I have a plan. Chase raised an eyebrow. A plan? She nodded, walking over to him and sitting down next to him. Yes, a plan that will get us out of this. But you need to trust me, Chase. He stared at her for a long moment, unsure. Then he sighed. What do you want me to do? Vanessa's smile widened. I need you to play along. Richard Monroe will fall for this. He's already in too deep. The key to his destruction lies in his past, and I'm going to make sure he never sees it coming. Chase took a slow sip of his drink, contemplating. All right, let's do it. In the days that followed, Richard's plan to dismantle Holloway Enterprises was set into motion. He had called in his best operatives, his financial experts, and his most trusted allies. Chase Holloway's empire was nothing more than a house of cards, and Richard was determined to watch it collapse. He had already begun buying up stock, moving money, and taking over Holloway's real estate investments. It was only a matter of time before Chase realized what was happening. But Richard's vengeance wasn't just about money. It was about making Chase suffer, making him feel the pain that his daughter had endured. One evening, as Richard sat in his office, he received a call from Evelyn. "Sir, we've intercepted some sensitive information. It's about Vanessa." Richard's interest peaked. "What about her?" "She's been using Holloway as a pawn in a much bigger game. We've traced some of her movements back to Vanguard Solutions." Richard's eyes narrowed. "Vanguard?" Evelyn nodded. "Yes, they're a private security firm, but they're far more than that. They've been operating in the shadows for years, pulling strings in global finance, government, and now they're tied to Vanessa." Richard's fist clenched. "This is bigger than I thought." As Richard dug deeper into the conspiracy surrounding Vanessa and Holloway, he realized just how high the stakes had become. Vanessa wasn't just a mistress or a business partner. She was a mastermind, a manipulator who had been playing both him and Chase for years. Richard's mind raced. He needed to act fast. The web of lies was growing tighter, and if he wasn't careful, he might find himself trapped in it too. But he wasn't going to stop, not now. Not when Emily's pain still echoed in his chest. "I'll make sure they all pay," Richard whispered to himself as he stared out of the window, watching the city light up under the night sky. Starting with Vanessa, the days turned into weeks, and the sense of urgency weighed heavily on Richard Monroe. Every move he made in his pursuit of vengeance seemed to come with its own set of complications. The walls were closing in on Chase Holloway, but Richard had begun to see something darker lurking in the shadows, a force far more dangerous than Chase's lies. It wasn't just about money. It wasn't just about the empire that Holloway had built and now threatened to lose. Richard was slowly unraveling a web of deceit that stretched far beyond Holloway's reach, a conspiracy that involved not only his daughter's husband, but also Vanessa, the woman who had been hiding in plain sight, playing a dangerous game of her own. Richard's thoughts were sharp, calculated, but every revelation about Vanessa's connection to Vanguard Solutions made the situation increasingly murky. Richard spent the evening at his private estate in the city. His study was bathed in the soft light of a single desk lamp, papers strewn across the desk. He scanned financial statements, court documents, photographs. Everything about Vanessa screamed manipulation. Her ties to the underground security firm Vanguard were becoming clearer with every lead, and that meant something much darker was at play. "I've made my living by controlling everything around me. But sometimes there's something even more dangerous than money. Power that hides in the dark, pulling strings from behind the scenes. Vanessa was that power, and if I didn't cut the head off this snake soon, I'd lose everything." Evelyn entered the room, her voice calm but filled with urgency. "Sir, we've got a problem." Richard looked up sharply. "What now?" "We traced the money trail from Vanessa's personal accounts, and it's not just linked to Holloway's assets. It leads to multiple high-profile accounts, including government contracts, intelligence agencies, even military operations. Whoever she's working with isn't just playing the game. They've rigged the whole system." Richard's mind raced, but he didn't let the shock show. "Vanguard's reach is deeper than I thought." Evelyn nodded grimly. "Exactly. We're not just dealing with a few shell companies. This is global, and it goes back decades. Vanessa's tied into something much bigger than either of us realized." Richard stood, walking to the window, the city lights below him shimmering like false promises. "Then it's time to make them play by my rules. But we need more." Evelyn furrowed her brow. "More? What do you mean?" "I need leverage. If we can't destroy their empire from the outside, we'll tear it apart from the inside." Richard's voice was cold, ruthless. "We'll use Vanessa's past against her. We'll make her a liability. Chase Holloway had no idea what was coming for him. His world was slowly slipping through his fingers, and every attempt to regain control felt more futile than the last. His empire was unraveling, one real estate deal at a time. His creditors were tightening the noose, and his reputation was in tatters. But what gnawed at him the most was the silence, the absence of Emily. She wasn't answering his calls. She wasn't returning his text. He couldn't afford to lose her, but he didn't know how to fix what he had done. He needed to act fast. But what could he do? He hadn't realized how deep the hole he was in was until it was too late. One afternoon, as he sat in his penthouse, brooding over the mountain of problems in front of him, Vanessa entered. She looked at him with the cold confidence that always unsettled him. But this time there was something in her eyes, something calculating. "You look like you've been hit by a truck," she said, her tone mocking. Chase didn't respond. Instead, he gestured to the papers scattered around him. "Everything's falling apart. My assets are frozen. My reputation's destroyed. I can't keep up with all of this." Vanessa didn't seem fazed. She walked toward him, her steps slow, deliberate. "It's not all lost," she said softly. "You still have power, Chase. You just need to focus on the right things." He shook his head, his frustration rising. "What do you mean? You know what's going on. The media's crucifying me. The money's drying up. My whole life is falling apart, and you're telling me to focus on the right things? What the hell does that mean?" Vanessa stopped in front of him, her voice low and persuasive. "It means that this, all of it, is just a distraction. The real power lies in the people behind the curtain, the ones who make decisions that shape entire countries." Chase's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" Vanessa smiled faintly. "I'm talking about Vanguard. We can't fight them, Chase. They're too big, but we can join them." Chase was silent for a long moment. He wasn't sure if she was just trying to manipulate him or if she was serious. But one thing was certain. The man he had been was no more. He wasn't the self-made millionaire who could build an empire on his own anymore. He was at the mercy of the people Vanessa was talking about. He stared at her, a mixture of anger and fear on his face. "You want me to sell out, to join those shadows? You've got to be kidding me." Vanessa's gaze never wavered. "It's not selling out, Chase. It's survival." As Richard dove deeper into his plan, he found more and more evidence of Vanessa's tangled web. She had played every angle, manipulating people like pieces on a chessboard. And now, with her alliance to Vanguard, she was more dangerous than ever. But Richard had no intention of letting her get away with it. The next day, Richard's team uncovered something even more sinister. They had tapped into a series of encrypted communications between Vanessa and her contacts within Vanguard. It was clear now, Vanessa had been orchestrating not only Chase's rise to power, but had also been positioning herself to take over his entire empire once he was out of the picture. She'd been using him, just like she had used everyone else. Vanessa wasn't just a mistress or a partner in crime. She was a mastermind, a woman who thought she could control everything. She had no idea who she was dealing with. Richard set the plan in motion, mobilizing every resource he had. He wouldn't let Vanessa and her shadowy allies use his daughter's pain to further their own agenda. Emily had spent days in the hospital, her body healing, but her mind still trapped in the past. She couldn't escape the memories of that night, the fall, the blood, the feeling of her world being torn apart by the man she had once loved. But then something shifted inside her as she sat in the hospital room, staring out the window at the falling snow. Something deep within her began to rise, a strength she hadn't known she still had. "I thought I was broken. I thought losing the baby was the end. But maybe it was just the beginning." She had lost Soma, her child, her trust in the man she had married, and the life she thought they would have together. But in that moment, she realized something else. She had been given the chance to start over, to take back control. When Richard came to visit her later that evening, Emily had made a decision. She wasn't going to let Chase win. She wasn't going to be his victim any longer. She looked at her father, her eyes determined. "What's the plan?" Richard stood up from his chair, his face hardening. "We've been playing defense long enough. It's time to go on the offensive." Emily nodded slowly. "What do I need to do?" Richard leaned in, his voice low. "You'll be the one to finish it, Emily. Chase won't know what hit him. The evening before the final move was made, Richard stood on the balcony of his penthouse, looking out at the sprawling city below. The lights twinkled like stars in the distance. But tonight, it wasn't the city he was focused on. It was the man who had caused all of this. Chase Holloway had no idea what was coming. The game was over, and Richard Monroe was about to claim victory. He had waited years for this moment, and now it was finally here. The final confrontation was near. Richard could feel it in his bones. And when it came, Chase Holloway would wish he had never crossed the Monroe family. The moon hung high over New York, casting a silvery glow over the city. Below, the streets were alive with the usual bustle, cars honking, people moving in all directions, each lost in their own world. But within the walls of Richard Monroe's private estate, there was a different kind of stillness, the kind that precedes the storm. Richard stood in front of a large map on the wall, his hands clasped behind his back as he surveyed the pins and notes marking every key point of Holloway Enterprises holdings. The web of financial accounts, properties, and shell companies that Chase had used to conceal his empire was vast, but Richard was methodical. Every thread was now within reach. Evelyn walked into the room, holding a tablet in her hand. "Everything is in place," she said. "Chase's assets are in the process of being seized. The media has already begun questioning his financial stability. He's on the edge." Richard's eye flickered toward her. "Is he aware of the storm coming?" "Not yet, but he will be soon." Richard nodded, his face hardening. "Good, but we need more. We need to break him, for good." Emily sat on the edge of her hospital bed, looking out the window. The world outside was quiet, peaceful even, but inside a storm was brewing. She had spent so much time hiding from the truth, from her pain. But now it was time to face it. You can spend your whole life running from your demons, but eventually they catch up. And when they do, you have two choices: keep running or stand and fight. Richard had told her everything. How Vanessa and her associates in Vanguard Solutions were the true architects of their suffering. It wasn't just Chase who had wronged her. It was a network of people who used power and greed as weapons. She had been nothing but a pawn, a casualty of their twisted game. But that was going to change. As Emily looked at the city below, her phone buzzed. It was a message from her father. It's time. Chase Holloway had never been one to lose control, but now as the pressure mounted, his once unwavering confidence began to crack. The threats he had ignored in the past were now closing in on him. His bank accounts frozen, his real estate deals falling apart. The media was no longer his ally, and his calls for help fell on deaf ears. But there was one thing he still had: Vanessa. He paced back and forth in his penthouse, his mind racing. "What the hell is going on?" he muttered, picking up his phone and dialing her number. Vanessa answered immediately. "Chase, you need to stay calm." He laughed bitterly. "Calm? How can I stay calm when everything is falling apart? My empire is collapsing, and I don't even know who's behind it." "It's Richard Monroe." Her voice was steady, confident. "He's coming for Yuko. But don't worry, I've got a plan." Chase stopped in his tracks, his heart racing. "Monroe?" Vanessa's voice softened. "Yes, he's been orchestrating everything from the start. He's playing you, Chase. You're nothing but a pawn in his game." Chase's face twisted in anger. "I don't care about Monroe. I care about surviving this. What's your plan?" Vanessa paused for a moment before replying. "We need to move fast. We can't fight him directly, but we can destroy everything he's built. I've already set the wheels in motion. We'll use his own resources against him." Chase nodded, his desperation giving way to a cold resolve. "Do whatever it takes, but make sure I don't lose everything." Back at Richard's estate, the final preparations were underway. Every move had been calculated, every possible angle covered. Richard stood with Evelyn, going over the final details of their strategy. "We'll hit them hard. Vanguard, Vanessa, Holloway, all of it. The moment Chase realizes what we've done, it'll be too late. By then he'll be so deep in debt, so far removed from reality, he won't know which way is up." Evelyn nodded, her expression focused. "I'll make sure the media has everything they need. This isn't just about ruining him financially, Richard. It's about stripping him of everything he holds dear." Richard's eyes darkened. I don't want just his money. I want him to feel the weight of his actions. I want him to understand the cost of crossing me. And when he does, he'll wish he'd never been born. Emily's mind was racing as she sat in her hospital room, the weight of the decision pressing on her. It was one thing to seek justice, but another to truly let go of the past and embrace the anger that had festered inside her for so long. The door to her room opened quietly, and her father stepped in, his face grim but determined. He sat down beside her, his voice low but firm. Emily, we can't go back. Chase's destruction is inevitable, but there's a price to pay for this. Revenge consumes everything, even the one who seeks it. Emily looked at him, her expression conflicted but resolute. I know. I don't want to become like him. I don't want to become a monster, but I can't let him get away with what he's done to me. To us. Richard nodded slowly. You don't have to become like him, but this is the only way. It's the only way to make him understand the damage he's caused. Emily stared out the window again, her fingers gripping the edge of the bed. I'll do what it takes. For me. For my baby. For everything he's taken from me. The morning of the final move arrived. Richard stood in his office, overlooking the city. His phone buzzed with updates. Everything was in motion. Holloway's empire was already beginning to crumble under the weight of the financial strikes that had been dealt to him. The beauty of a well-laid plan is that it works even before the enemy knows it's happening. They'll scramble, they'll try to fight back, but it won't matter. Their world will burn from the inside out, and I'll be the one to watch it all fall apart. Evelyn entered with a folder in hand. The first reports are coming in. Chase's accounts are frozen. His companies are under investigation for fraud. The SEC is already looking into his real estate deals. The media is about to go public. Richard gave a sharp nod. Good, now we turn the screws. Prepare the press release. I want them to hear this straight from us. Let them know what he's been hiding all these years. Chase sat at his desk, hands trembling as he read the report. His empire was disintegrating before his very eyes. The accounts were frozen. The banks were pulling out. The real estate deals were falling apart one by one, and it was all Richard Monroe's doing. He tried to call Vanessa, but her phone went straight to voicemail. Damn it, Vanessa, where are you? He slammed his fist on the desk in frustration. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was his assistant, looking pale and panicked. Sir, we've just received an anonymous tip. There's a video coming out. It's from your security footage. It shows you. Chase's heart stopped. He jumped to his feet. What does it show? The assistant hesitated. It shows you hitting your wife. It shows everything. Chase staggered back, his mind racing. He hadn't realized how deep his lies had gone, how far he had pushed himself into a corner. How is that even possible? Someone's leaking it to the press. Chase's eyes widened in realization. It's Monroe. With each passing hour, the walls around Chase grew tighter. The media had already begun to pick up on his story, and the leak was everywhere. The video had gone viral. His reputation was in tatters. Richard Monroe's vengeance was unfolding exactly as planned, and Chase was too late to stop it. Emily, sitting in the hospital room, watched the news as the anchor's voice delivered the damning report. Chase Holloway, the tech mogul and real estate tycoon, is now under investigation for fraud and assault. Exclusive footage of the billionaire has emerged, showing shocking evidence of domestic violence against his pregnant wife, Emily Holloway. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, but there was no sense of relief. This wasn't over yet. It was only the beginning. She stood up, a newfound strength surging through her. It's time. Richard walked into the room, his face grim but resolute. You've made your decision? Emily nodded. I'm ready. Richard placed a hand on her shoulder. We finish this. For good. The city glimmered beneath a pale winter moon, every skyscraper lit like a monument to power. It was the night of the Crescent Foundation Winter Gala, a glittering event for New York's elite. Politicians, CEOs, investors, and reporters. But tonight, amid the champagne and chandeliers, something far darker was about to unfold. At the heart of it all was Emily Monroe, or as the press still called her, Emily Holloway. Dressed in a floor-length gown of crimson satin, she looked like a phoenix risen from ashes. Beautiful, composed, untouchable. No one who saw her would imagine that just weeks ago, she had lain broken and bleeding at the bottom of a marble staircase. But tonight wasn't about her pain. It was about her power. Inside the limo, the silence was almost sacred. Richard sat opposite his daughter, his sharp blue eyes fixed on her, pride and worry battling for dominance. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. Emily smiled faintly. "Yes, I do." Evelyn, seated beside the driver, turned slightly. "The press list is full. Everyone who matters will be there. Investors, board members, half the city's media outlets. One wrong move, and this will explode." Emily adjusted her diamond earrings, her voice steady. "That's exactly what we want." Richard exhaled, half in admiration, half in fear. "You sound like your mother." "Then she'd be proud," Emily said, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, the silence between them felt warm, an understanding that everything they'd lost, every pain endured, had led to this night. The limo pulled up to the hotel entrance. The paparazzi were already gathered, flashes bursting like fireworks. A sea of cameras turned as the red-dressed woman stepped out, her heels clicking against the marble. Revenge isn't rage, it's precision. The sharpest blade is the one that looks like elegance. Across the ballroom, Chase Holloway was already the center of attention. He'd crafted his image perfectly. The heartbroken husband, the misunderstood businessman, the phoenix rebuilding his life after tragedy. He wore grief like a tailored suit, but beneath the charm, fear gnawed at him, and the leaked video had gone viral. Investors were fleeing, lawsuits were piling up, and worst of all, whispers of Monroe's involvement were spreading. Vanessa, always perfectly composed, leaned close to him, whispering, "Smile, the cameras are on you." Chase's lips curved into a fake grin. "If I make it through tonight without someone throwing a drink in my face, I'll call it a win." Vanessa's gaze flickered toward the entrance and froze. "Well," she murmured, "speak of the devil." Chase followed her eyes, and the color drained from his face. There she was, Emily, suave, radiant, and walking straight toward him. The ballroom fell silent as Emily entered. Heads turned, cameras flashed, reporters whispered furiously. She didn't flinch. She walked through the crowd with quiet grace, her father and Evelyn following at a distance. Chase straightened his tie, forcing a smirk. "Emily, I didn't expect to see you here." Emily's voice was calm, but it carried across the room like glass slicing silk. "I'm full of surprises, Chase." Vanessa tensed beside him. "This isn't the time." "Oh, I think it's exactly the time," Emily interrupted smoothly, her eyes never leaving Chase's. "You always liked an audience, didn't you?" He forced a chuckle, trying to diffuse the tension. "You shouldn't be here. You are still recovering." "Recovering?" She smiled coldly. "You mean after you shoved me down the stairs? After you killed our baby?" The air vanished from the room. Every conversation died. Reporters froze mid-step. The orchestra faltered into silence. Chase's mask cracked. That's a lie." "Really?" Emily said, reaching into her clutch. She pulled out her phone, tapped the screen, and the massive LED wall behind the stage came alive. The video played, the sound of thunder. Her scream, his voice shouting, "You think you can leave me?" The ballroom gasped. Vanessa's hand flew to her mouth. Chase turned ghost white. Reporters raised their cameras in unison. The crowd erupted into chaos. Breaking news. Billionaire Chase Holloway faces a massive scandal tonight as shocking footage emerges of what appears to be domestic abuse against his wife, Emily Holloway. As the media storm raged outside, inside the ballroom, Chase stumbled backward, muttering, "You ruined me." Emily stared him down, her voice calm, deadly. "No, Chase, you ruined yourself." Security moved in as the crowd closed around them, microphones and flashes filling the air. Chase tried to lunge forward, but Richard's hand landed firmly on his shoulder. "Touch her again," Richard said softly, "and you'll never use your hands again." For a moment, Chase looked like he might strike, but the sight of cameras killed the impulse. He straightened, eyes cold with hatred. "You think this ends with me?" he hissed. "You have no idea what you've started." Before anyone could react, he shoved past the guards and disappeared into the crowd. Emily stood still, trembling slightly, her heart pounding. The world she'd built in that one brave act was already spiraling beyond her control. Hours later, Richard, Emily, and Evelyn sat in a quiet hotel suite. The city glittered beyond the glass, but the noise from below was relentless. Sirens, news helicopters, reporters camping outside. Evelyn was on the phone speaking rapidly. Yes, release the full statement. No interviews. She's done her part. Emily sat on the couch, staring at her reflection in the window. Her hands were shaking. Richard approached quietly, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. You did it. Emily's voice was hollow. Then why doesn't it feel like victory? He didn't answer immediately. Because revenge doesn't heal, he said at last. It only stops the bleeding. Emily turned to him, tears in her eyes. I don't want to bleed anymore, Dad. He squeezed her hand. Then don't. You've taken back your voice. The rest, we'll handle. But somewhere across the city, in a dim underground parking garage, Chase Holloway was not finished. He paced beside a sleek black car, his breath visible in the cold air. The man standing across from him wore a dark coat and an expression carved from ice. You failed, the man said quietly. Chase's eyes darted. You don't understand. Monroe destroyed everything. The man held up a hand. We understand perfectly. That's why you're being extracted. Extracted? Chase repeated, confused. Wait, what does that mean? But before he could move, two other men stepped out of the shadows. A sharp sting hit the side of his neck, and darkness swallowed him whole. Evelyn entered Richard's study the next morning. Her face was pale. He's gone, she said. Chase, he never showed up for questioning. The police found his car abandoned. No sign of him. Richard's expression didn't change. He won't get far. You don't understand. She placed a file on his desk. The security footage from the garage is gone, wiped clean, and the guards who were supposed to escort him, they're missing too. Richard's eyes narrowed. Vanguard. Evelyn nodded grimly. This wasn't an escape. It was an extraction. That night, Emily sat alone in her room, finally allowing herself to breathe. The city lights glowed outside her window. She closed her eyes, whispering a prayer for peace. Then her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Her heart skipped a beat as she opened the message. You think I'm gone? You should know by now, Emily. I never fall that easy. The phone slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the floor. For a long time, she just stared at the screen, her reflection pale in the glass. Then trembling, she whispered, Oh God, he's alive. The dead don't haunt us because they're gone. They haunt us because they never really leave. The wind howled outside the Monroe estate, rattling the windows like a warning from something ancient. Snow fell in heavy sheets, blanketing the world in white silence. But inside, tension buzzed through the mansion like static before a storm. Emily hadn't slept in 2 nights. The text still glowed in her mind. You think I'm gone? I never fall that easy. Each word echoed like a heartbeat she couldn't silence. She sat at the kitchen table, gripping a mug of untouched coffee. Evelyn entered, dressed in black and looking more tense than usual. You should rest, Emily, she said softly. Emily's eyes were hollow. How can I? He's alive, Evelyn. He's out there somewhere, watching. Evelyn sighed, setting down her tablet. We've traced the message. It bounced through 3 proxy servers, but the last ping was local, less than 20 miles away. Emily's breath hitched. He's here. Before Evelyn could answer, heavy footsteps approached. Richard entered, wearing his overcoat and a look that could cut steel. We're not waiting for him to strike, he said. We're taking this fight to him. Richard spread a series of photos across the table. Satellite images, surveillance stills, reports marked confidential. He's using someone's help, Richard said, tapping the photos. And I know who. Vanessa. Emily's blood ran cold. She's still alive? Evelyn nodded grimly. She didn't just vanish after the gala. She's been consolidating power, moving Vanguard's assets. She's protecting him or controlling him. Richard's tone hardened. Either way, we end them both. Emily shook her head, voice trembling. Dad, this isn't a boardroom war anymore. These people don't negotiate, they kill. Richard leaned closer, his eyes fierce. Then let them try. Hours later, in a room filled with screens and security feeds, Evelyn briefed the team. We've traced a warehouse on the docks, abandoned for years, but power's been rerouted there in the last week. I think that's where Chase is hiding. Richard nodded. We'll strike at dawn. Emily stays here. Emily stood up immediately. No, I'm coming. You've been through enough, Richard snapped. Her eyes blazed. Wackley, I've been through enough to know this doesn't end until I face him myself. Richard hesitated, then slowly nodded. Fine, but you do exactly what I say. The next morning, gray fog clung to the waterfront like a ghost. Black SUVs rolled in silently, tires crunching over gravel. Richard, Evelyn, Kellen, the ex-military security head, and Emily stepped out into the cold. The warehouse loomed ahead, massive, windowless, its steel doors rusted but reinforced. Kellen spoke into his earpiece. Alpha team in position. No movement yet. Then, bang. A single gunshot echoed from inside. Move, Richard barked. They burst through the doors. The interior was dim, filled with crates and shadows. The smell of oil and gunpowder hung in the air. At the center of the room stood Chase Holloway. His face was burned, half covered by a bandage. His once pristine suit was torn and bloodstained. His eyes cold, furious, unrecognizable. You couldn't leave it alone, could you? He growled. You took everything from me, and still you came for more. Emily froze. You tried to kill me. Chase's laugh was low and bitter. And yet here you are, still ruining my life. From the shadows, another figure emerged. Vanessa, dressed in black combat gear, she looked both beautiful and deadly. Mr. Monroe, she purred, you never did finish what you started 20 years ago. Richard's eyes narrowed. Vanguard, you used me to build your empire, and when I walked away, you tried to destroy my family. Vanessa smirked. Not destroy, evolve. You created monsters, Richard. I just gave them purpose. She turned to Emily, her voice soft and venomous. You were supposed to die that night, but I must admit, you've grown into quite the distraction. Emily's hands clenched into fists. You used me. You used him. Everyone's used by someone, Vanessa said calmly. The only difference is whether they realize it in time. Kellen raised his gun, but Vanessa moved faster, a flash, and he went down, blood spreading across his shoulder. Gunfire erupted. Chaos filled the warehouse. Sparks flew as bullets ricocheted off steel beams. Richard pulled Emily behind cover. Stay down, he shouted. Chase grabbed Vanessa's arm. You said you'd help me. You said I'd get everything back. Vanessa smiled coldly. You got what you deserved, Chase. You were just the bait. She shoved him forward, straight into the line of fire. Bullets ripped through the air. Chase stumbled, collapsing to the floor, eyes wide in shock. His last words were a rasp. You never loved me. Vanessa didn't even look back. Evelyn shouted over the gunfire. She's rigged the place. Bombs in the walls. Richard grabbed Emily's hand. We're leaving, now. They sprinted through the smoke as alarms blared. Vanessa fired again, the explosion's timer beeping behind her. Emily turned back, eyes locking on the woman who had destroyed her life. For a brief second, their gazes met, predator and survivor. Then Emily whispered, not this time. She threw a flare toward the nearest fuel line. The spark hit the leaking oil. The explosion ripped through the warehouse like thunder. Hours later, emergency lights flashed red and blue across the docks. Firefighters battled the flames as dawn broke over the city. Richard stood wrapped in a blanket, his face grim. Any sign of her? Kellen, pale but alive, shook his head. Nothing. She's either dead or gone underground. Richard nodded, looking toward Emily, who sat silently in the back of an ambulance. Her face was streaked with soot, her eyes distant. Evelyn joined him quietly. It's over. Richard looked at his daughter, then at the rising sun. No, he said softly, it's never over. Not for people like us. They thought breaking me would end my story, but sometimes surviving is the cruelest kind of revenge. She turned to her father, managing a faint, weary smile. Let's go home. The first rays of dawn touched the city like hesitant fingers brushing over a scar. The warehouse on the docks was still smoldering, a blackened shell against the silver horizon. Fire crews were packing up, Reporters shouted questions that no one answered. And somewhere beneath all that noise, a story was ending, or beginning again. Emily sat on the back steps of an ambulance, wrapped in a thermal blanket. The paramedics had offered her sedatives, but she refused. Her eyes were locked on the burning remains of the place where everything had ended. Chase, Vanessa, Vanguard's lies. But she didn't feel triumph, just exhaustion. Richard approached slowly, his overcoat singed at the edges, soot streaking his jaw. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "You should rest." She shook her head. "Every time I close my eyes, I see it again. The stairs, the fire, the blood. I just want it to stop." He crouched beside her, his expression softening. "It will. Not today, maybe not tomorrow. But it will." Emily looked up at him. "Do you really believe that?" Richard hesitated, then gave a small, tired smile. "I have to. You're all I have left." Later that morning, Evelyn stood in Richard's office, reviewing the security reports. "No sign of Vanessa," she said. "Authorities found 2 bodies, Chase and one of Vanguard's operatives. The second body's too damaged for identification. Could be her, but—" Richard looked up from his desk. "But it's not." Evelyn frowned. "You think she's still alive?" "A woman like Vanessa doesn't die in fire. She waits for the smoke to clear." Evelyn exhaled. "Then what do we do now?" Richard leaned back, eyes fixed on the window. "Now we rebuild, but this time on our terms." For the first time in months, Emily returned to the Monroe estate, the only place that still felt like safety. Snow blanketed the lawns, muffling every sound. Inside, the fire crackled gently, filling the hall with warmth. She walked slowly through the corridors, her fingers brushing over the framed photographs on the wall. Her childhood, her mother's smile, her father's younger face, the ghosts of a happier time. In her old bedroom, she found the small music box her father had saved, the one that had played the lullaby for the baby she'd lost. She wound it gently. The melody began to play, soft and fragile, like forgiveness. "I used to think healing meant forgetting, but it doesn't. It means remembering without breaking." She sat on the window ledge, looking at the morning sky. A new day, not free of pain, but full of possibility. Downstairs, Richard spoke at a press conference. The world had been waiting for his statement ever since the scandal consumed both families. Reporters filled the room, cameras flashing. Richard stood at the podium, his voice steady but heavy with truth. "For years, I built my life around power, believing it could protect the people I loved. I was wrong. Power doesn't save. It corrupts. And in that corruption, I lost everything that mattered." He paused, glancing toward the back of the room where Emily stood quietly. "But my daughter reminded me what power truly is. The courage to face the truth no matter how much it hurts. Today I'm dissolving Monroe Global and donating its assets to the Crescent Foundation to support survivors of domestic violence. The empire ends here, and something better begins." The applause was hesitant at first, then grew until the sound filled the hall like thunder. Richard stepped away from the podium, shoulders lighter than they had been in years. That night, as the snow fell gently outside, a courier arrived at the Monroe estate with a single envelope. It bore no return address, only Emily's name written in sharp, elegant handwriting. She opened it slowly. Inside was a note on black stationery. "You may have burned my kingdom, Emily, but you can't kill the shadow it left. We're not finished. V." Her fingers trembled as she folded the note back into the envelope. For a moment, fear returned. Then resolve. She walked to the fireplace and tossed the letter into the flames, watching it curl and vanish. The next morning, Richard and Emily sat together on the veranda, watching the sunrise. For once, there was peace. Fragile, imperfect, but real. "So," Richard said softly, "what will you do now?" Emily smiled faintly. "Live." He chuckled. "That's a start." She turned to him, her voice steady. "You taught me how to fight. Now it's time I learn how to forgive." He looked at her, pride glinting in his tired eyes. "Your mother would have said the same thing." They sat in silence as the sun climbed higher, melting the last traces of snow. "They say revenge gives you closure, but that's not true. Revenge gives you silence, and it's up to you what you fill it with. I've filled mine with truth, with loss, with love that refused to die. Because monsters don't just live in other people. They live in the fear we let rule us. And once you stop fearing them, they lose their power. Emily rose from her seat, letting the morning light spill across her face. She walked down the steps into the garden, no longer running from ghosts, no longer defined by them. Behind her, Richard watched with a small, knowing smile. The story that had begun with violence ended at last, with peace.